Welcome back for Lesson 2 in World History 1. Today we're going to be talking about Mesopotamia. We're looking at your textbook's Chapter 2, but we're only going to be looking at a part of Chapter 2 in World History, Culture, States, and Society to 1500. We're really going to focus on pages 21 to 37. We're only talking about Mesopotamia. The Lesson 2 objectives for this PowerPoint include understanding the geographical features of Mesopotamia, including the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, explaining the importance of the Code of Hammurabi and give examples of some of its laws, discussing the religious practices of the Mesopotamians, and outlining the plot, characters, and themes of the Epic of Gilgamesh and why it is a timeless tale that holds significant lessons. So we're going to be talking about the Code of Hammurabi today and the Epic of Gilgamesh, but you'll actually be reading more about those. We ended Lesson 1 talking about common characteristics of civilization, and I want to review those very quickly, but I also want to go back and talk about how scholars have discussed civilization. In the 1950s, civilization was really seen as ancient empires, glorious architecture, and the lives of the ruling class and the luxury that they experienced during their lifetime. In the United States, students in the 1950s took Western civilization, and it focused on Europe and Middle Eastern cultures. But today, students are taking courses in world history, not Western civilization. More recently, scholars have examined the time period between 3500 to 1000 BCE, and they've actually identified 7 independent civilizations that emerged in different regions. And we're actually going to look at some of these civilizations, but we will look at other civilizations as well. We'll look at civilizations in Africa and other places. These 7 independent civilizations that scholars have identified, they all have common characteristics of civilization. This includes food surplus. Well, what does that mean? These civilizations have food stored up, enough food that can support their population for a period of time. They have high population densities. This means there are a lot of people living in the same area. There's social stratification. That means there's a hierarchy. There are people at the top, are the upper or ruling class, and then there are people at the bottom, the lower class. There's a system of taxation. There are labor specializations in these civilizations. So some people may work with metal, some people may work in agriculture, other people may be priests. These civilizations practice regular trade, so they are trading, and they have an accumulation of knowledge. They pass down knowledge from generation to generation. So if we look at the earliest civilization, we're going to turn to the Fertile Crescent in northeastern Africa. But today we're going to focus on the Fertile Crescent. So as we talk about ancient Mesopotamia, we'll be talking about a place often referred to as the Fertile Crescent. Archaeologists found the earliest known agricultural producing sites in the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is located near the Tigris and Euphrates River. There's little rainfall in this area, but the Tigris and Euphrates rivers provide large amounts of fresh water for agriculture and for the development of early civilization. This area wasn't necessarily called Mesopotamia by the people that lived there during the time that we're studying. The Greeks actually named the region when they were studying ancient societies, and they named it Mesopotamia. It literally means the land between the rivers. So I guess it's named because it's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The lands between the river. Mesopotamia is a Greek word that means the land between the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they really begin in the Tarsus Mountains of the eastern Anatolia, and they work their way down and empty into the Persian Gulf. So if you look at your screen here, my cursor is at the Tarsus Mountains here, and they're going to work their way down to the Persian Gulf, and the Persian Gulf is located right here. The rivers will carry silt down the stream, and it makes the soil better as it carries the silt down. In the north, there is little rain, but in the south, there are concentrated months of rainfall followed by long dry spells. So this really encourages settlements to develop near the rivers because they could not settle away from the rivers because they did not have access to a steady rain supply. Most of these early settlements are going to be along lower Mesopotamia or near the Persian Gulf. They settle there because there's extremely fertile soil. Remember, the rivers are bringing silt down, and some of these cities that we'll see emerge include Ur and Ur. But these two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, have floods that are very unpredictable. They're way more unpredictable than the Indus River. So the Tigris and Euphrates rivers have very unpredictable floods, and the residents tried to create canals and drainage ditches to control the flow of the water and store water in reservoirs for dry months. The people that lived in lower Mesopotamia built houses out of mud. They didn't really have much else. They did trade, which is part of being a civilization, and traders brought in wood, stone, and precious metals from places like Assyria, Anatolia, and other areas that were around the Persian Gulf. They were actually trading with people as far as modern-day India. They were really looking for luxury items, and by 2500 BCE, Mesopotamian elites were buried in imported goods, including beads. And by trading, Mesopotamians also learned more about ideas and technologies of other areas. In the previous slide, we talked about Mesopotamia, and we said that early settlements developed in lower Mesopotamia. As the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are moving down, and eventually they empty into the Persian Gulf. So a lot of the early settlements are in lower Mesopotamia near the Persian Gulf. By 3000 BCE, we see Sumerian city-states emerge, and so we're going to look at Sumerian city-states from 3000 BCE to approximately 2334 BCE. Sumer was located in lower Mesopotamia. In the map in the previous slide, we looked at lower Mesopotamia. This is the area that is the lower part of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where they empty out into the Persian Gulf. Prior to 3000 BCE, Sumer had several city-states, but by 3000 BCE, we know that there are at least 12 Sumerian city-states. These city-states are independent city-states, so they are their own city-states. They have their own government, and they exist on their own. A few examples include Ur, Isin, Legish, Uruk, and Nippur. They had a lot of similar characteristics, though. Even though they're independent, they have common characteristics. So we're going to take a look at common characteristics of Sumerian city-states. These Sumerian city-states had a temple complex, and they're often called ziggurats. The people that lived in the Sumerian cities, they believed that the city belonged to the main deity. So not every city-state had the same god, but they each had their own main deity. So they had a main deity for each independent city-state. These people that lived in the Sumerian city-states, they were polytheistic. This means that they believed in multiple gods. Monotheistic means that they believe in a single god, but these people actually believed in polytheism. They believed in multiple gods. The ziggurats, or the temple complex, housed priests and priestesses, and these priests owned land. These temple complexes had outbuildings, including granaries and storage sheds, and this allowed the people of the Sumerian city-states to have food surplus. But like I said, they are polytheistic. They worship multiple gods and goddesses. They actually believed that gods had a family, and so they built shrines and temples for gods and their families. So cities actually had a number of temples, but there was normally a main temple. The ziggurats were normally rectangular towers made out of sun-dried bricks, and this is actually the example of the ziggurat in Ur. It is actually the best preserved example of a ziggurat. It was made out of 720,000 baked bricks, and it was built up to the height of 100 feet, and it was built as a temple to the patron deity of Ur, the moon god Nana. Offerings were brought to these temples throughout the cities because they wanted to make the gods who they believed controlled the natural forces of the world happy. The priests and the priestesses collected and they controlled offerings. And this really shows social stratification and social hierarchy and specialized labor that is a required characteristic of a civilization. These priests controlled religion and agriculture, but these cities very much had a distinct identity based on their main deity or their main god. Like I said, Ur's main god was a god named Nana, but other cities had their own main god, but they had other gods as well. There is conflict in Sumerian city-states. There's conflict not only in the independent city-states between the people that live in the city and the people that live in the countryside surrounding the city, but there's also conflict and conquering between the city-states, and conflict and conquering led to more centralization of the Sumerian city-states. The Sumerians do have a written language, and it helps us learn more about them. It's called cuneiform. Cuneiform was developed by priests to keep track of business transactions, but because they developed cuneiform, we know more about their civilization. We know that 90% of the populations were farmers, but there were other skilled people that lived in these Sumerian city-states that ranged from animal breeders to merchants, craftspeople, fishermen, soldiers, architects, and scribes. Another example of specialized labor was metalworking. We know that by 2900 BCE, there were bronze producers in Sumerian city-states, and bronze was stronger than copper, and it allowed them to produce stronger weapons and farming tools. If we further examine the Sumerian city-states, we know that slavery existed in the Sumerian city-states, but there was two different types of slavery. But slaves work in several different capacities. They perform tasks such as construction, weaving, agricultural, and domestic labors such as tending to animals, and they even worked as administrative workers such as scribes. But going back to the two different types of slavery, there was chattel slavery, which that means the slaves were seen as property with no rights. They were often prisoners of wars or from outside communities, and they were branded by barbers or tattoo artists. The other type of slavery in the Sumerian city-states was debt slavery, and it was more widespread. And it was a temporary status. These debt slaves were slaves until their debts and interest were paid off. And so that's what we know about slavery in the Sumerian city-states. I mentioned cuneiform in the previous slide, but I want to go into a little bit more detail on it. The Sumerians developed cuneiform around 3200 BCE. Cuneiform is a written script of wedges and shape marks, and this is actually an example of cuneiform from about 2800 BCE all the way to 600 BCE, and you can see the words that they translate to. Priests originally used cuneiform, but others used cuneiform as well. Cuneiform was one of the earliest written scripts, or one of the earliest written languages that we actually know about. Merchants, scribes, administrators, and priests all use cuneiform to record information about financial information, court and administrative information, and even architectural plans. Cuneiform also allows us to learn more about the Sumerians' legends, their poems, chants, and prayers. But most people in Sumeria at this time are not literate, so scribes were the people that were generating most of the records. So not only was cuneiform used for business transactions, but it was also used to keep laws and develop mathematics. Sumerian mathematics was based on the number 60, and that's still seen in some modern math today. Well, if we look at some of these examples based on the number 60, time is based on the number 60. If we look at the hours, the number of minutes in an hour is 60. The number of seconds in a minute is 6, so it's still seen in some modern math today. How were these scribes writing cuneiform? Many of them were using stylus of reed to write on clay tablets that were dried and stored. We know that laws and legal documents were recorded in cuneiform as well. And these laws that were recorded in cuneiform provide ethical guidance for the people of Sumerian city-states. They also use proverbs for ethical guidance, and we can see examples of that in some of the remaining examples of Sumerian cuneiform. So we're able to understand some of the Sumerians' values and views. by looking at the existing clay tablets that we found that have cuneiform on them. We can talk a little bit more about Sumerian religion. I said earlier on that one of the common characteristics of a Sumerian city-state is that they had a ziggurat, which was their temple, their main temple for their main deity. And I also said that Sumerians were polytheistic, but let's take a little bit closer look at the Sumerian religion. Sumerian religion was polytheistic. This means multiple gods. Remember, this is versus monotheism, which is one god, but these Sumerian city-state people worship multiple gods, and each Sumerian city-state had their own primary deity or their primary god. And there are some examples. The primary god of was Nana. Other primary gods in the Sumerian city-states were An, Ki, Enlil, and Shamash. These gods were sometimes hostile toward humans, according to the Sumerian people's beliefs. They really believed that floods or droughts were a result of the gods being angry, so they brought tribute to the temples. And remember, Sumerian city-states had that main temple, the ziggurat, but there were also other temples throughout the city for other gods, and they would bring tributes to these temples to appease the gods because they believed the gods were angry at them when things like floods or droughts occurred. But religion helped these Sumerian people explain the meaning of life, and as we said, there were ziggurats or temples that were in the middle of Sumerian city-states. They were the main temple of the city, but there were other temples throughout the cities. But there were these rituals that were designed to please the Sumerian gods. So religion was very important to the Sumerian people because it helped them explain life. And this is actually an example of a Sumerian god, Enlil. But it's very important to their culture, and we're able to understand their culture because of some of the architecture that they've left behind in these ziggurats, but also because we have cuneiform. We can understand a little more about what they thought about religion. Another important legend that we learn about from the Sumerian culture is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it really tells us the adventures of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is a legendary king from Uruk, one of the Sumerian city-states. But the Epic of Gilgamesh is really the first epic poem ever, and it tells the story of this legendary king, Gilgamesh of Uruk. And if we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, which you're going to read some of it, it gives the people a sense of shared culture, values, and dreams, and it also helps us understand how the Sumerian people explain death. Originally, the Epic of Gilgamesh was told orally. It was an oral tradition. And for this reason, there's several versions because as people passed it down, passed this accumulated knowledge down, sometimes they change things. So there's several versions. But eventually, it was written down in cuneiform around 1800. Some people say 2000 BCE. It was written down in cuneiform between 2000 BCE and 1800 BCE by the Babylonians. If we look more into the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, it tells us about loyalty and humility in the Sumerian culture. It also portrays a gloomy afterlife. An example is a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It says, "People see no light, they sit in darkness," end quote. So it really portrays the afterlife as miserable for all. So it really helps us understand death in the Sumerian culture. Gilgamesh himself, this legendary king, fails to find eternal life, but he does work for the glory of the gods and for human achievement. So you're going to read some of the Epic of Gilgamesh and you'll notice some of these things. You'll especially see that death in the afterlife is very gloom. We've talked about Sumerian city-states, and we said there were at least 12 of them. They were independent city-states with their own rulers. They had their own main deity god in Lower Mesopotamia or Sumer. Over time, leaders of one city-state wanted to conquer other city-states, and there was conflict, and people were trying to control other city-states. And so this leads us to empire. Now I want to talk about the Akkadian Empire, which exists between 2334 BCE and 2100 BCE. The king of this empire is Sargon of Akkad, and he really started the first empire in Mesopotamia. A little more about him: he rose from obscurity and he became a powerful king. If we look at one Babylonian tablet from the 7th century BCE, it describes Sargon as a descendant of high priestess and an anonymous father. Another story talks about Sargon rising up by conquering Sumerian city-states one by one. And he did conquer Sumerian city-states one by one. An empire is a large territory with numerous states under a single authority. And Sargon was able to do this because he conquered several Sumerian city-states, and eventually he conquered territories in Anatolia, parts of Syria, and Elam. And to maintain his single authority in these areas, he used public monuments like statues of himself, pillars, and other statues throughout the empire. He also built statues that celebrated military victories, and he sought to build unity in his empire. We know that the capital was Akkad. We don't know where it is. We do have an estimated location. We think that it was north of early Mesopotamian city-states, and Sumer. The Akkadian Empire was very famous for its trade. It had trade routes as far as India, and trade goods were taxed. Sargon ruled for 50 years, then his sons, grandson, and great-grandson ruled. So the empire lasted around 200 years. After 200 years, there were outside attacks from neighboring people, and this really caused the Akkadian Empire to fall. The next empire we're going to talk about is the Babylonian Empire, and the dates in your textbook are 1792 to 1595 BCE, but we know that those dates are sometimes a little off. Some people place the Babylonian Empire starting in the 1800s BCE. But those are the dates your textbook used: 1792 BCE to 1595 BCE. These people were originally known as the Amorites. The leader that ruled the Babylonian people from the beginning was Hammurabi. He created this new empire, the Babylonian Empire. And Hammurabi had well-disciplined foot soldiers that had copper and bronze weapons, and he used those soldiers to conquer Mesopotamian city-states, including Akkad and Sumer. So they were very strong. They had up-to-date technology. They had bronze weapons. Hammurabi put his capital in Babylon, and he built that city up. But he also created a code, Hammurabi's Code, and it was a code of law. You'll actually read some of the code of law. But there's something called the Stele of Hammurabi, or Hammurabi's Code. It's a comprehensive set of laws. It's not the first law code in the world, but it is intact. We know a lot about Hammurabi's Code, and it is one of the early law codes in the world. And Hammurabi used his law code to give him power and legitimacy. There were laws of retaliation in the Code of Hammurabi. An example is an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. But it is important to know that offenses and punishments varied by social class. An upper-class person's punishment could differ from a lower-class person's punishment. So it's very important to remember that Hammurabi's Code has very specific outlines on what the punishment will be, not only for people, but for people of different social classes. The code attempted to unify people in the empire because it had a common standard of law. Here are some more examples. If someone stole property from the temple or the court, they would be put to death. If a person stole cattle or sheep, they had to pay 30-fold if that cattle or sheep belonged to a god or the court. If it belonged to a free man, they had to pay 10-fold. If the thief had nothing to pay, they would be put to death. Another example is if a house doesn't return a runaway slave, the head of that house would be put to death. Law 129 of Hammurabi's Code said that if a wife was surprised with another man, both would be thrown in water, but the husband may pardon his wife. 195 says if a son strikes his father, his hands would be taken off. So these are some of the examples of Hammurabi's Code. You will be looking at them. Another thing that Hammurabi did as a leader, he attempted to improve infrastructure, promote trade, and install better administrative practices. So they had roads and a postal service. But we know that after Hammurabi's death, the successors began to lose territory, and the empire began to shrink in size. By 1595 BCE, the Hittites conquered Babylonia. And the Hittites were from Anatolia, so they were coming from outside in and attacking the Babylonian Empire, and they were able to control the Babylonian Empire by 1595 BCE. The next empire I want to talk about is the Assyrian Empire, and it really thrives between 900 BCE and 612 BCE. The Assyrian Empire was larger than any empire before, so it was larger than any previous empire before. It stretched from modern-day Turkey to Egypt, and it conquered much of the ancient Middle East. Sometimes it's seen as a bully of the Middle East because of the way that they waged war. The Assyrians were well equipped when it came to their military. They had well equipped soldiers with stronger iron weapons, and for this reason, their empire was really able to expand into other areas like Mesopotamia, Syria, part of Anatolia, Palestine, and the Upper Nile and Egypt. So they really did conquer much of the ancient Middle East. They had large armies of maybe 150,000 soldiers. The core of that army was the infantry, cavalry, and chariots. They really tried to make their enemies fear them, and for that reason I say that they bullied others, and that's how some people referred to them. They even decapitated, conquered kings, burnt cities, and destroyed crops. They really hoped that these methods would deter potential rebellions in the areas that they conquered. And they really took away from the conquered communities. They took spoils of war, including precious metals and livestock, and they used that to finance further military campaigns. When they conquered areas, men would be conscripted or drafted into the army. Sometimes they would be resettled and deported to become laborers. The Assyrians also extracted annual tributes from these areas that they conquered. If we look at the Assyrian Empire, there were some fairly large cities, but the two largest cities in the Assyrian Empire were Nineveh and Ashur. Each city had several million people. Administratively, kings ruled Assyria, but they had appointed governors that oversee provinces, and they had delegates that would be sent to allied states. There were about 100 to 150 governors, delegates, and top officials that helped the king. Later in the Assyrian Empire, kings would choose their officials by merit and loyalty. But eventually, the Assyrian Empire starts to decline because it became too large to control. There were increased numbers of rebellions, and they had a very difficult time controlling the empire, so cities began to fall. And eventually, the empire will fall in 1612 BCE after the fall of one of their largest cities, Nineveh. But before we move on, I want to point out some things that are very important in Assyrian law. So the Assyrians, again, thrived between 900 and 612 BCE. They had laws too. The Assyrian laws reflected their violent and warlike culture. Women in the Assyrian culture were given a very low status. There were harsh penalties against adultery, abortion, and homosexual rape. So they had a law system as well. We know that we've already looked at Hammurabi's code when we were talking about the Babylonian Empire, but the Assyrians also had laws as well. And they really tell us more about the Assyrian society. We know the Assyrians are violent and warlike, and that is very much reflected in the Assyrian laws. The last empire I want to talk about in Mesopotamia are the Chaldeans, or the New Babylonian Empire. And the New Babylonian Empire actually rises at the time the Assyrian Empire is declining. The Assyrian Empire falls in 612 BCE when Nineveh falls. But at the same time, you've got this New Babylonian Empire rising in 626 BCE and continuing to thrive as time moves forward. So by 612 BCE, the New Babylonian Empire is doing pretty good for itself. Probably the most famous ruler of the New Babylonian Empire is a king called Nebuchadnezzar II. If you've read Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament in the Bible, you would know that Nebuchadnezzar II is a ruler from 605 BCE to 562 BCE. And Hebrew scripture or the Old Testament in the Christian Bible describes Nebuchadnezzar as a ruthless leader. He is well known for his architectural projects and for being this ruthless leader. He destroyed the city of Jerusalem and deported many of the city's Jews to Babylon, and he stated that the Jews could not return to their homeland. Nebuchadnezzar II actually rebuilt the city of Babylon. He wanted to return Babylon to its former glory. He added fortresses, temples, and big palaces, and he wanted to have the glory of ancient Babylon. So he does this by reviving elements of Sumerian and Akkadian culture. He celebrated kings like Hammurabi, so he celebrates the old kings, and he actually rebuilt the ziggurat in Babylonia, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. He also decides that he wants to build a garden for his wife. And he builds one of the most famous gardens of the time. It's called the Hanging Garden of Babylon. Later on, Herodotus, a very famous Greek historian, he called the Hanging Garden of Babylon one of the 7 wonders of the world, and it's still considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world today. The garden had gardens on rooftops and terraces, and the leaves spilled down the high walls, but the archaeologists of today still have not located the Hanging Garden of Babylon. The death of Nebuchadnezzar II really led to internal conflicts, and eventually outside people are going to try to take over the New Babylonian Empire as well. So there's outside military pressures and internal conflicts that are going to damage the New Babylonian Empire and weaken it. But it continues to exist even after Nebuchadnezzar's death. The final Chaldean king is Belshazzar, and he was actually more worried about partying than he was protecting his city, Babylon. Eventually, by 539 BCE, the Persians conquered the New Babylonian Empire. And this is where I'm going to leave off today, talking about Mesopotamia and it going from a civilization with city-states to an area with empires.